seemingly conquered the world. Some have done it through peaceful means, while others have done it through war. Some have done it through technology, and others have done it through exploration. Regardless, each one of these empires was able to become the most powerful civilization in the world by spreading their influence throughout the entire human population. But now we are entering a new age of empires that the world has never seen before. An era of unbound potential and possibilities where we might be seeing a new kind of empire being built in a brand new economic, technological, and political frontier. What would you do if your population was rapidly growing and you were running out of land for your people to live on? Also, what would you do if you wanted your country to become wealthy beyond its wildest dreams? And lastly, what would you do if you wanted your country to be known as the most innovative and culturally superior people of the time? Well, these are the questions that the European nations in the 15th century were asking themselves. And there was one single answer to all of these questions, and that answer was the Age of Discovery. In the early 15th century, the Portuguese began sending ships along the African coast and into the Atlantic for 3 reasons. The first of which was that they wanted to take control of the African coast for militaristic purposes. The second was that they wanted to find better trade routes and resources. And the third was that they wanted to spread Christianity. Now, the Portuguese ended up discovering the Atlantic islands of Madeira and the Azores in 1420 and 1427 respectively. They also found that wheat and sugarcane were easy to grow on these islands, so these islands ended up making Portugal significantly wealthier while helping feed its citizens. Despite discovering these islands in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, the Portuguese and all European nations at the time had no idea what existed past Cape Bojador, which was a point in northwestern Africa. In fact, there was a fear that anything past this point was the end of the world and wouldn't allow for any explorers to return. So, exploration past Northwest Africa did not occur until 1434, which was just after the invention of the new ship technology called the caravel. Now, this new ship technology led to a dramatic increase in exploration, where the Portuguese found and settled in many parts of Africa, such as Ghana, the Gulf of Guinea, Sierra Leone, Mozambique, and Mombasa, while also settling in parts of India, Southern Asia, and Brazil. The addition of these lands to the Portuguese Empire ended up giving Portugal a dramatic increase in trade and resources, which made the country go through an economic boom. And during this time, other European nations began to notice the success of the Portuguese Empire. So many other European nations began exploring as well in hopes of increasing their wealth and military power while spreading their culture just like Portugal. The Spanish settled in the Canary Islands in 1436, then conquered the Caribbean in 1502, Panama in 1513, Mexico in 1519, Peru in 1531, most other South American countries by 1582, and Florida and Texas by 1622. Now, this led to an economic boom for the Spanish Empire, where they gained access to many valuable resources such as gold and spices. And the British had a similar story in the 17th century when they captured Jamaica, the Bahamas, Bermuda, Barbados, Maryland, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Carolina, and New York, and they eventually settled in all of these places between 1624 and 1663. And over the next several centuries, the British kept expanding, and by 1913, the British Empire would expand to Canada, Australia, India, East and South Africa, parts of East Asia, New Zealand, several South American countries, and much more. And this British Empire became the largest empire in the history of the world. It had about 23% of the world's population under its ruling, while having control over 25% of all land on Earth. Now, this rapid colonization and expansion of the British Empire led to the saying, "The empire on which the sun never sets," meaning that the empire was so big that the sun was always shining on at least one part of its territories at all times. This also led to an unprecedented economic power imbalance, where 25% of the world's GDP in 1870 came from the British Empire. Meanwhile, other rich nations, such as the United States, only had 9% of the world's GDP. And the reason why the British's wealth was able to grow so much is because they controlled so much land, resources, and trade routes around the world. But all of these empires that were created in the Portuguese, the Spanish, and the British were only made possible by a daring exploration of an unknown frontier. They created habitable settlements, usually with just a few hundred people at a time, and they eventually made massive advancements in technology which allowed for faster travel and better extraction of resources. So now that brings us to today. You see, many countries right now are asking themselves the same questions that Europeans were asking themselves in the 1400s. But today there's a problem. How can a country in modern times become extraordinarily wealthy, be known as the superior nation of the world, and expand the land area for which its people live when there isn't any land to expand into? I mean, virtually all land on Earth is claimed by some country or nation, except for 4 strange spots. The first is the Arctic. The second is Antarctica. The third is a 2,060 kilometer squared plot of land called Bir Tawil in between Egypt and Sudan. And the fourth is called Gornja Saiga, which is a plot of land between Croatia and Serbia that currently has no owner. However, several individuals have tried to claim the land as their own and attempt to start their own country. One of these attempts was by a libertarian politician who wanted to call this land Liberland and have its national currency be a new cryptocurrency, but this claim has not been recognized by any international authority. But anyways, what I'm trying to say here is that if a country wants more resources, land, or better trade routes today, they cannot simply go on an expedition and attempt to colonize the uninhabited world. That is why many countries are turning to different methods in order to grow their nation's controllable land, trade, and resources. Ocean water on its own is not that valuable, as no one can live in the ocean, build a business in an ocean with a few exceptions, or grow food in an ocean. But land near an ocean can become extremely valuable by having the capability of building oceanfront houses, shipping ports, or desalination stations. That is why in 1955, the Netherlands decided to drain the bay water in Flevoland, which created a massive artificial island called Flevopolder, and today that artificial island is home to over 317,000 people. Several other countries have done something similar in order to help out with their economic and population needs. For example, Hong Kong's international airport was created on an artificial island. Willingdon Island in India was created to make a key port location and naval base, and the United Arab Emirates has completed many artificial island projects that are mainly used for housing and hotels. Even though some countries view the ocean as the next source of innovation and way to expand their economy, there are some that are looking to a different frontier. A frontier that is located right above your head. In the 1950s, the public viewed space as a frontier that really didn't have much of a purpose outside of military and defense. In fact, NASA's funding was almost directly correlated with the public's perception of the need to go into space. So that is why in the 1950s and 60s, the public viewed space investment as another form of defense investment from the Soviets. But once the public thought that NASA won the space race in the late 1960s, they thought that there wasn't a utility for space investment anymore, which is why NASA's budget was cut by 80% from 1966 to 1975. But what the public did not know at the time was that space would soon become a key player for the world's economy. In 1975, there were only a few dozen satellites orbiting the Earth at any one point in time, and most of these were very primitive and could only do a few basic functions that didn't affect consumer life down on Earth. Meanwhile, today, the Earth has over 5,000 satellites orbiting it at any one point in time, and these serve a wide range of purposes. For example, GPS applications like Google Maps, Waze, and Apple Maps are all multi-billion-dollar utilities that rely on just 30 satellites currently orbiting the Earth. Satellite imagery is also a massive industry that has developed from the space economy. This technology has been used for things like making YouTube videos and showing maps on screen. It has also been used by GIS engineers like I used to be, where I used satellite imagery to determine the best commercial investment locations, and satellite imagery has also played a major role in many other industries, such as fishing, meteorology, oceanography, forestry, geology, and the military. In fact, there are countless billion-dollar industries that have spawned through this new space economy that did not exist in 1975. For example, digital image sensors used in virtually every camera, ventricular assist devices, LASIK technology, cochlear implants, artificial limbs, invisible braces, 3D printed foods, anti-ice systems, fire-resistant materials, memory foam mattresses, enriched baby food, cordless vacuums, the Bowflex water purification, and many other technologies have all been spin-offs of the NASA space program. And the thing is that all of these technologies were not in the public's mind just a few decades ago. Yet some of them, like the GPS and satellite imagery industries, play a large role in the daily life of citizens around the world today. Right now, the space industry generates about $400 billion per year in revenue, and is indirectly responsible for well over $1 trillion worth of commerce on Earth, and that number is growing fast. For example, companies like Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and other aerospace giants are generating about 5 to 20% of their revenue from space-related activities, and that percentage is growing every year. And I bet you didn't know that there's a handful of space manufacturing companies and space pharmaceutical companies currently operating in the Earth's orbit as you are watching this video. But here's the thing, is that as of right now, doing anything in space is expensive. Or at least, it was. In the 1960s, it cost roughly $85,000 to launch 1 kilogram into space. From 1970 to the year 2000, it cost roughly $30,000 to launch 1 kilogram into space. But then, with the advancements in rocket technology from companies like SpaceX, the cost of putting 1 kilogram into space today is only about $1,400. Meaning that the standard payload that would cost about $5 billion to put into orbit during the Apollo missions now costs about $80 million today. And some of those payloads today are actually being bought in bulk by separate companies for the same launch. So if one SpaceX rocket can carry 64,000 kilograms of payload into space, that payload might be carrying 100 different objects from 100 different companies at the same time. So essentially, space is now becoming a much more economical venture than it used to be just a few decades ago. And this is why I see a parallel between what we are going through now in the modern space age and what the early explorers did many centuries ago. You see, something that I didn't mention earlier was that Viking explorers discovered North America hundreds of years before the Spanish. However, because the Vikings did not have an economical method of sending supplies to North America, they never fully settled in the New World. They only stayed for brief periods of time before fully abandoning their exploration in the 1400s. In fact, at the time, a typical Viking ship would only carry a few dozen people at a time and would hold around 70 tons of cargo. It wasn't until several hundred years later that sea exploration and settling became economically viable. This was because the new ship technology, such as the galleon, the carrack, and the caravel, were now able to carry several hundred people at a time, as well as between 250 and 500 tons of cargo. And almost immediately after this advancement in ship technology and economic viability, we started to see an increase in the investment of exploration of a new frontier. And that is where we might be today with space. We are on the brink of making space travel economically viable for most countries and many medium to large businesses. And that is why in the last decade we have seen such an influx of startups, small, and relatively poor countries get into the space industry. For example, did you know that Luxembourg, Turkmenistan, Bolivia, Sri Lanka, and Poland have all started space programs in the past decade and have launched satellites into orbit? You see, space is no longer just a venture for the richest countries in the world. But now that brings up the question, where might the future return on investment of space come from? Well, here are a few things going on right now. SpaceX and Amazon are launching their own internet service by launching hundreds of satellites into orbit. Currently, several hundred of these satellites have already been launched, and there will actually be a beta test for this new internet within the next 6 to 12 months. Virgin Galactic has focused heavily upon the space tourism and travel industry. Their unique hybrid rocket plane design has made it possible to take off from a runway, then enter suborbital space, and safely land on another runway. And even though this might seem like it is just for tourism, it might actually be a replacement of the airplane in the future. Because a typical plane will travel around 500 miles per hour during its flight, but because the Virgin Galactic Unity spacecraft travels through space, it can reach speeds of up to 2,500 miles per hour. Meaning that a flight from New York to Hong Kong that would typically take up to about 16 hours could now be completed in about 4 to 5 hours instead. But arguably the most important part of the future of the space economy might come from colonization and property rights. I mean, let's really think about this for a second. If a company like SpaceX were to send humans to Mars by 2024, or maybe potentially have a Mars habitation by 2040, would the people on Mars have property rights to the land that they settle on? According to the current space treaty, every spacefaring country in the world has agreed that there is no such thing as ownership of any part of a celestial body outside of Earth. But then what happens to the colony on Mars? What laws or rules do they follow? Do they make their own? This will bring up a ton of questions within the next few decades. I mean, if 10 people were to become the first habitants of Mars in 2040, there is no nearby governing body to tell them that this is not their land. So theoretically, SpaceX could call their colony Elon Musk land, and there wouldn't be a single governing body on the planet that could kick them off Mars or punish them. Now, if that were to happen, it would be very likely that the company on Earth would face some sort of repercussions. But the Mars claim of land and property rights might still hold to be true. And if that were to happen in the future, theoretically, if you could colonize Mars before anyone else, you might theoretically be able to control the laws and resources of that part of the planet. And interestingly enough, by most metrics, most of the resources that are under the Martian surface are very similar to what we have on Earth, meaning that colonizing Mars and dominating space might be the next economic and geopolitical frontier for humankind, similar to what the Europeans went through roughly 600 years ago. And even though this future might seem far away to some of you, I would be willing to bet that the future is much closer than you think. And keep in mind that from the time that the Vikings initially discovered and tried to settle on North America to the time that it became economically and technologically viable to actually settle there, that time difference was nearly 600 years. And I know that there's a ton of other challenges that come with trying to live on Mars, but as technology advances and space travel becomes more economically viable every single year, we might be seeing some new empires being built in the final frontier. So what do you think of the space industry, and what are your thoughts on the land claims and laws on Mars? Let me know in the comments down below. And make sure to check out my documentaries playlist on my channel, as it has a bunch of videos very similar to this. And please hit that like and subscribe button, it really helps me out a lot in the channel when you do that, so please do those things. But anyways, make sure to click on my documentaries playlist, and I will see you guys in the next video in just a few seconds.